One of the convicted killers at the center of the popular Netflix docuseries Making a Murderer is asking for his life sentence to be reduced. Brendan Dassey's legal team is announcing today they're petitioning the governor of Wisconsin to grant him clemency.
In October 2005, Teresa Halbach disappeared after visiting the Avery salvage yard in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin. Her car was found abandoned, but the investigation soon hit dead ends as leads went nowhere. Despite several false theories and conflicting reports, police struggled to find the truth. As time passed, the case caught the nation's attention and raised curiosity and questions. Friends and family were desperate for answers and hoped that Teresa would be found. What really happened to Teresa? Was her disappearance a tragic accident or the result of something much darker? Let's get into this puzzling case.
Please bring her home. That's all we want. Just bring her home. Please, somebody find her. That's all we want.
Calumet County is famous for its cheese and was Teresa's small hometown. The area was peaceful and picturesque and provided a serene backdrop for Teresa's early life and bright future. Teresa Halbach was born on March 22, 1980, and grew up in Calumet County, Wisconsin. She was just 25 years old when her life was tragically cut short. But before that, she was a young woman with a promising future. She was one of 5 siblings in a supportive family and rose on a dairy farm. Teresa wasn't just a small-town girl, but she was also a standout student. After graduating from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay in 2002, she returned home to get her life started. Like many children in their 20s, Teresa was finding her way and living in a farmhouse next door to her parents while figuring out her next steps. She was close to her parents and her siblings, and she spent a lot of time with them. She even coached her younger sister's volleyball team. They loved hanging out together, watching shows like Extreme Makeover and spending quality time on the family farm. Her love for photography had always been a passion, and by 2005 it became her career. Teresa worked as a freelance photographer and had shoots for weddings and events. She even worked for Autotrader.com, an American online marketplace for car buyers and sellers, where she photographed cars for sale. It was through this freelance job that she came into contact with Steven Avery, who hired her to take pictures of a vehicle at his family's auto salvage yard. The Avery Auto Salvage Yard was an extensive 40-acre property with scrapped cars, parts, and equipment scattered throughout. Steven and his brother Charles ran the yard, and their sister Barb, along with her 3 sons, Brendan Dassey and her boyfriend Scott Titch, lived on the property. Teresa had visited the salvage yard several times earlier that year to photograph cars for Steven. But she wasn't exactly excited about going back. One time, she reportedly told a co-worker that Steven had answered the door wearing only a towel, which she found disturbing. Who wouldn't feel uncomfortable in that situation? Despite her discomfort, Teresa agreed to go back for one final shoot on Halloween Day, 2005. Sadly, it would be the last time anyone would see her alive. On the afternoon of Halloween 2005, Teresa Halbach arrived at the Avery salvage yard to photograph a vehicle. Her plan was simple, to just snap the photos and leave. However, things took a darker turn, and by November 3rd, Teresa's family had reported her missing. No one had seen or heard from her since she went to the salvage yard a few days earlier. She hadn't returned calls from her mom, which raised concerns. Teresa was an independent young woman with a busy life, and while her family was understandably worried, they also gave her the benefit of the doubt and thought she might just be out living her life. But when Teresa's absence stretched into days without any word, her family knew something was wrong. Volunteers from the town assembled together to search for her, but it wasn't until November 5th that they made a crucial discovery. Teresa's Toyota RAV4 was parked on the Avery property. The car was strangely covered with branches, wood, and even the hood of another car. Was the vehicle hidden? There's been speculation about that.
Steven Avery is away from the search tonight, staying near Crivets. He says he has no idea why Teresa Halbach's car was found on his family's property. Do you have any idea how her SUV ended up on your family's land?
You got me. I don't know.
While it seemed as though someone tried to hide the car, it was a failed attempt. After all, with so many vehicles on the property, why would anyone need to hide one? It raised questions about why the car was covered, but the true reason remained unclear. Once Teresa's car was discovered at the Avery salvage yard, police obtained a search warrant and began a series of 6 searches on the property from November 5th to November 12th.
Steven Avery spent most of the day under heavy police surveillance.
I couldn't move, couldn't leave, and they were always there.
Officers took a car and a flatbed truck from his family's North Woods retreat. His sister's son was driving to get groceries when it happened.
These searches revealed several disturbing pieces of evidence. In a burn pit behind Steven Avery's garage, investigators found burned bone fragments, which were later identified as Teresa's remains through DNA testing. Blood was found in both the front and cargo areas of Teresa's RAV4, and remains of her cell phone, Palm Pilot, and camera were located in a burn barrel on the property. During a search of Steven Avery's house, police found Teresa's car key in his bedroom, along with 2 firearms, including a rifle. Months later, further searches led to the discovery of a bullet and fragments in Avery's garage, which were linked to the rifle found in his home. While the bullet contained DNA evidence, it raised additional questions about the case, as it was still unclear who the DNA belonged to. This collection of evidence ultimately built the case against Steven Avery, but it left many questions unanswered and fueled public controversy. When Steven Avery was questioned, he gave an initial statement without legal counsel.
So Teresa comes out the second time to take pictures of the van, and the van is parked between you and your sister, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So she writes down the serial number after she takes the picture, and then how much was it charged for that?
$40.
$40, yeah.
He said that was the last he saw of her. However, law enforcement quickly grew suspicious of his story. He was initially arrested on charges related to the illegal firearms found on the property, which intensified things rapidly. Just a few days later, on November 15th, Steven Avery was officially charged with the murder of Teresa Halbach. His bail was set at $500,000. The evidence, particularly the blood, the bones, the car key, and the firearm, left little doubt in the eyes of investigators. What makes the case of Steven Avery so striking is that he was no stranger to law enforcement. This led us to the dark history of Steven Avery. He was born in 1962 in Manitowoc County and grew up on his family's 40-acre salvage yard in rural Gibson. Struggling academically, he attended special education classes and had a reported IQ of 70. At 18, Avery was convicted of robbing a bar and served 10 months. In 1982, he was sentenced to animal cruelty after burning a cat alive and was jailed for a year. In 1985, Avery threatened his cousin with a gun and was sentenced to 6 years. However, in 1985, the most significant chapter of his criminal history began shortly after, when Avery was wrongfully convicted of the brutal sexual assault and attempted murder of Penny Burnson. Despite his alibi, Avery was identified by Burnson and sentenced to 32 years in prison. In 2002, the Wisconsin Innocence Project took up his case and used DNA testing to release Avery, and provided another man, Gregory Allen, who was actually responsible for the crime. After serving 18 years, Avery was released in 2003. He later filed a civil lawsuit against Manitowoc County and its officials and asked for $36 million for the wrongful conviction. The lawsuit was still pending in 2005 when Teresa Halbach disappeared. The case was settled in 2006 for $400,000. While Steven Avery awaited trial for the murder of Teresa Halbach, investigators conducted a series of interviews with individuals who lived or worked at the Avery salvage yard. One person who caught their attention was Brendan Dassey, who was Steven's 16-year-old nephew. Initially, in February 2006, police didn't see Brendan Dassey as a suspect, but believed he might know something about Teresa Halbach's disappearance. They thought he was protecting his uncle. However, during the interrogation, Brendan began making charges that didn't match the behavior of someone innocent, and it raised concerns. Following an initial interview, police suspected Brendan had crucial information. Brendan's IQ was borderline, which means it was lower than most people's.
Come on, Brendan, be honest. You can do it. Just tell us the truth.
I grabbed her arm, put it on the side, and tied her up.
Although Brendan was 16 years old, his abilities and understanding were closer to that of a younger child. Investigators conducted 2 additional interviews with Brendan without his mother or counsel present. Before the final interview, they obtained his mother's consent. This contentious interview took place on March 1, 2006.
He said, "Hey, Brendan, you want to help me do something?" I said, sure, and then later I came over there and Dad, he wanted me to come over there and help him move something.
During this session, Brendan confessed to participating in Teresa's sexual assault, murder, and mutilation. Over several hours, police assured Brendan they already knew the details. A visibly frightened Brendan provided a detailed statement. He claimed to have returned home from school and been invited into his uncle's trailer where he found Teresa tied up. His uncle allegedly encouraged him to sexually assault Teresa as she pleaded for help. Brendan asserted that he complied after his uncle's persuasion, and that his uncle subsequently stabbed and shot Teresa. At his uncle's command, Brendan slit Teresa's throat. Brendan's arrest and charges of sexual assault, murder, and mutilation of a corpse marked a stunning turn of events. However, no verifying evidence supported his confession at that point. Regardless, both Brendan and Steven faced trial, which proceeded separately. Steven Avery's trial commenced first. Prosecutors presented substantial evidence, which included blood in Teresa's vehicle, a spent bullet matching Steven's rifle with Teresa's DNA, and a key to her vehicle found in Steven's trailer with his DNA. Steven's DNA was discovered under Teresa's car's hood fastener, and his blood was inside her vehicle. Teresa's burnt remains and belongings were found on Avery's property. Phone records revealed Steven's 2 calls to Teresa's cell phone, one using the *67 feature to conceal his identity, and another without it. The *67 feature blocks your phone number from showing up on the recipient's caller ID and makes the call appear as private or unknown. These raised suspicions and suggested Steven may have been unaware that police could track the *67 call. Bobby Dassey, Brendan's older brother, testified that he saw Teresa heading toward Steven's trailer on the afternoon of her murder. He also overheard Steven discussing Teresa's body disposal in a later conversation and provided critical testimony. Although the evidence seemed unfavorable, Steven's defense team argued that Manitowoc County Police framed him due to his $36 million lawsuit against them. They alleged police planted blood in Teresa's vehicle using evidence from a previous wrongful conviction case. The defense team claimed that the key evidence raised doubts. The key of Teresa's vehicle found in Steven's trailer only contained Steven's DNA, not Teresa's. This was strange, as one would expect Teresa's DNA to be present on her vehicle's key. The absence of Teresa's DNA and the presence of Steven's DNA suggested evidence tampering, which pointed out that the key was planted and Steven was framed. The jury's verdict was conclusive that Steven Avery was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison. The trial of Brendan Dassey followed shortly in April 2007, which lasted only for a few days. The prosecution's case against Brendan mainly relied on his confession, which became a subject of intense debate over whether it was genuine. When looking closely at Brendan's police interview, there are troubling signs. After hours of questioning, he made statements that seemed to admit guilt, but many believed these were forced and not trustworthy. After detailing the alleged assault and murder, investigators pressed Brendan for additional information. When asked about Teresa's head injuries, Brendan hesitated, saying, "That's all I can remember." The officer pressured him further and inquired who shot her in the head. Brendan eventually agreed and stated that he had committed the act. The officer then asked why he hadn't mentioned it earlier, to which Brendan explained that he couldn't think of it at the time.
All right, I'm just going to come up and ask you, who shot her in the head?
He did.
Why didn't you tell us that?
So I couldn't think of it.
This exchange raised concerns that the investigators might have influenced Brendan's responses and guided him to provide information that may not have come from his own recollection. During his trial, Brendan withdrew his confession and claimed police pressurized him. Physical evidence, such as bleach stains on his jeans, had initially supported his involvement. However, Brendan offered an alternative explanation, saying that the stains resulted from cleaning a garage, not a crime scene. Notably, no DNA or verifying evidence directly linked Brendan to Teresa's murder. Brendan's conviction, which largely relied on his questionable confession, raised concerns about the fairness of his trial. At 17, he was tried as an adult, despite having a lower intellectual capacity. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in 2048. The case remained controversial, with ongoing debates about the reliability of his confession and whether his conviction was fair.
Dassey confessed to helping his uncle Steven Avery carry out the rape and murder of Teresa Halbach, but attorneys argue that the confession was coerced. Dassey was 16 when Halbach was killed back in 2005.
In August 2011, a state appeals court rejected Avery's request for a new trial, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld the decision in 2013. After serving 5 years at the Wisconsin Secure Program facility in Boscobel, Avery was moved to the Waupun Correctional Institution in 2012. In December 2015, Dassey's lawyers filed a petition for his release, which argued he had ineffective counsel and that his confession was forced. In 2015, Netflix released the documentary Making a Murderer, which followed the legal battles of Steven Avery and his nephew Brendan Dassey. It examined their arrests, trials, and convictions and raised doubts about their guilt. The series focused on issues with Brendan's confession, questionable evidence against Steven, and the strained relationship between Avery and local law enforcement, which led to his wrongful conviction in the 1980s. The documentary initiated a lot of debate and attracted a large audience, with many questioning if Steven and Brendan had fair trials. While it pointed out possible injustices, some critics felt it may have been one-sided, which left out key details. In 2016, a renowned attorney who fought for wrongful conviction, Kathleen Zellner, took on Steven Avery's case.
Kathleen Zellner is a Chicago-based lawyer who worked her way up to the Hall of Fame by representing many wrongfully convicted individuals.
Zellner, who had a history of overturning convictions, began exploring new theories of the case. She aimed to show that the evidence presented at trial didn't fit the story of Avery's guilt, and that other suspects may have been involved in Teresa Halbach's death.
My client's innocent, and the crime scene investigation was mishandled.
Zellner's efforts, combined with her public advocacy, brought renewed attention to the case and kept questions about Avery's innocence in the spotlight. Making a Murderer was not entirely objective. The prosecution chose not to participate, which some critics argue twisted the story. By refusing to engage, they left many questions unanswered and allowed the documentary to largely reflect the defense's perspective. Viewers questioned why the prosecution stayed out, with some speculating it was to avoid re-examining the legitimacy of Avery's previous wrongful conviction. While the documentary raised awareness and sparked debate, it missed important details. For example, it didn't fully address the phone calls Steven Avery made to Teresa Halbach's phone, which some see as key evidence. It also overlooked Avery's past interactions with Teresa, which included reports that she felt uneasy around him. Making a Murderer also downplayed Steven Avery's history of violent behavior, particularly towards women. While this alone doesn't prove his guilt, it does indicate a disturbing pattern of aggression that should not be overlooked when examining the case. The documentary also largely ignored key pieces of evidence, such as the bullet found with Teresa's DNA on it that matched Avery's rifle. This evidence could not be dismissed easily, yet it was given minimal attention in the series. The defense argued that the blood sample in Avery's case had been tampered with and showed a hole in the stopper. However, it was later revealed that the hole was a standard procedure by a nurse, and Avery's defense team had previously broken the seal. The tampering claim was ultimately false. The documentary also downplayed Brendan Dassey's controversial interrogation. Brendan, with a borderline intellectual disability, was questioned for hours without a lawyer or his mother. His confession, which played a key role in his conviction, was inconsistent and seemed to be influenced by leading police questions, raising doubts about its reliability. Brendan's confession was crucial to the prosecution's case, but there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. Therefore, despite questions about how it was obtained, his conviction relied almost entirely on the confession. The documentary did not adequately address the possibility that Brendan's statements were forced or that he was vulnerable to manipulation due to his age and intellectual limitations. The documentary may have sparked a global movement for justice, but it also left viewers with more questions than answers. It again complicated the story of whether these two men were truly guilty or victims of a deeply flawed justice system. The police later claimed that parts of Brendan's confession were misplaced in the Making a Murderer documentary, which, when viewed in full, might reveal more about how the police questioned Brendan. But regardless of the media coverage, the question remains, where do the cases stand today? And has justice truly been served for Teresa Halbach and her family? In 2016, Brendan Dassey's conviction was briefly reversed, which raised hope for his supporters. The main issue was whether his confession was forced, and the courts decided it was not. Concerns about his age and intellectual disability raised questions about his vulnerability during interrogation, with experts arguing this wasn't fully considered by the courts. In 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear Brendan Dassey's case, which ended hopes for federal relief. Wisconsin's governor has also refused to pardon him, which again left his legal options limited. While new evidence could reopen his case, his release remains uncertain, and many still believe justice has not been served. In contrast, Steven Avery's case remains controversial. Despite repeated denials of his appeals, Avery's attorney, Kathleen Zellner, continues to push for new testing of evidence and a retrial, and cited ineffective counsel and withheld evidence. However, these efforts have so far been unsuccessful, and Avery's conviction stands. While Zellner continues her work on Avery's behalf, the legal challenges he faces seem difficult. His case has not yet resulted in any substantial breakthroughs, and without new evidence or legal changes, it remains unlikely that his conviction will be overturned soon. For now, both Steven Avery and Brendan Dassey continue to serve their sentences, though public debate about the fairness of their trials and convictions. Dassey last applied for parole in 2021 but was denied and continues to pursue parole. In August 2022, Steven Avery's attorney, Kathleen Zellner, filed a motion for post-conviction relief and suggested that new witnesses could link Bobby Dassey, who was Brendan's older brother, to the murder of Teresa Halbach. This was a significant development, as it introduced the possibility of Bobby being involved in the crime, though it had been speculated before. Zellner's argument was that if there were other plausible suspects, it could open the door for Avery's relief. However, this theory raises the question of whether Bobby was working with the police to frame Steven, or whether two separate groups were involved in framing him.
have your blood in the car, it's huge. And so I wanted to spend a lot of time on it, and I wanted to do a bunch of experiments. No blood on the steering wheel.
Zellner provided an affidavit from a truck driver, Thomas Brez, who claimed to have seen Bobby Dassey driving Teresa's RAV4 days after her death with another person in the passenger seat who was not Steven. While this testimony adds a new layer, it's not conclusive evidence of Bobby's involvement in the murder. Additionally, Bobby's computer history, which showed searches for violent pornography, doesn't directly link him to the crime. Zellner also pointed to Bobby's alibi, which was provided by his mother's boyfriend, Scott Teutsch, a man with a criminal history and a reported anger. Zellner suggested that Teutsch could be involved, either by lying or participating in the crime. This, however, remains speculative without solid evidence. Another angle Zellner has explored is the involvement of Teresa's ex-boyfriend, Ryan Hellis. Ryan had no alibi and was deeply involved in the search for Teresa. Zellner found it odd that Ryan didn't disclose his past relationship with Teresa to the police and that he had access to Teresa's voicemail. However, despite these suspicions, there's no direct evidence linking Ryan to the murder. Zellner's request for a hearing based on these alternative suspects was denied by the court, which ruled that there was insufficient motive or evidence to suggest that Bobby, Teutsch, or Ryan were involved in framing Avery. The court essentially held that the defense had not demonstrated how these individuals could have planted evidence or carried out the crime. In 2022, Avery was moved to Fox Lake Correctional Institution, which is a medium-security prison. Zellner plans to file an appeal with the Wisconsin State Court of Appeals, but the case remains complicated. Some experts question Avery's innocence due to his violent history and potential corruption, while still raising concerns about Brendan Dassey's forced confession. The case remains unresolved and left unanswered questions about Teresa Halbach's death and ongoing legal struggles for the families involved.
What are your feelings for her parents? And
they must be going through hell.